Dr. B.F. Skinner, professor of psychology at Harvard University, has authored such important scientific books as The Behavior of Organisms, Verbal Behavior, The Technology of Teaching, and Contingencies of Reinforcement. In addition, he has written 2 books of general interest, which have been both widely received and highly controversial: the novel Walden II and Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Included in the many scientific awards bestowed upon him are the Distinguished Scientific Award of the American Psychological Association, membership in the National Academy of Sciences, and the President's Medal of Science. In this film, Dr. Skinner addresses himself to some of the most important issues facing education today. As we join Dr. Skinner and Dr. John M. Whiteley of Washington University, they are discussing what dimensions of human endeavor are not receiving sufficient attention in schools.
We certainly are ignoring many of the important aspects of our own culture in our present education. We're having so much trouble teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic that we don't prepare students to enjoy their lives. We boast of the fact that with our industrialization and so on, we're now giving people a great deal of leisure time. We cut the week down first to 5 days, and now they're talking about 4 days. We cut down the work hours. What are we going to do with all of this time which is suddenly being released, in which people don't have to do anything? If you don't watch out, what you will do are those things which are immediately gratifying and reinforcing. All leisure cultures have tended to go in for drunkenness or drug addiction, for spectatorship, the Roman circus, that kind of thing, watching other people living dangerously, gambling of all sorts, games of chance, and that. These are the things that people are likely to do when they don't have to do anything. Now, the trouble with that is that by the end of a full lifetime of exposure to this, you're no better off than you were. You can buy a lottery ticket every week of your life, and at the end of your life, you're the same person you were when you started. You can stay stoned or drunk all your life, and you've not acquired any new kinds of behavior at all. Watching other people live seriously or dangerously doesn't do that either. Now, if you leave it to the individual, those are the things he is likely to do. But the culture, through its educational facilities primarily, can teach people other kinds of reinforcements, other things that they can do to be reinforced, which actually will bring out all that there is in them. They develop arts, skills, talents of that sort, where by the end of your life you are a very different person. You are now an accomplished musician or an accomplished artist, or you're an accomplished listener to music, so you get more out of it than you ever did before. Or you read, not simply in the sense of living somebody else's life in a novel, but be more perceptive about people, understanding people better, and so on. These are the kinds of things that people could also do with leisure time, which would make them much more effective people. But they need support from the culture. They're not the things people naturally do, because they are more deferred by way of consequences. You need to prepare a person to be musical.
How does an educational system help develop people in this way?
Well, it would have to arrange temporary reinforcers to build the kinds of behaviors which eventually prove to be more highly reinforcing. If I sit and watch professional football on a Saturday afternoon, I get something very quick out of that. If, however, instead of that, I practice the piano or something like that, so that from then on I'm slightly more effective as a player, then I have done something which will increase my pleasure for the rest of my life, perhaps. Whereas the football game comes to an end, it's all over, and that's that. I may have bet on it or something of that sort, so I've been terribly interested in how it comes out. I've had a good 2 or 3 hours by way of immediate gratification, but at the end I'm back where I started from at the beginning. But if I do something which increases my skill or my general understanding of things or my knowledge, then I am in a position to do something different the next time, which will, at the end of my life, I will be as complete a person as I could possibly be.
What are some of the temporary reinforcers that those in education can use to foster this kind of constructive personal development? Clearly, the deck is stacked on the other side. Long-range behavior is much more difficult to develop
Yes.
than short-range behavior. It's also not seemingly as amenable to short-term adversive control that educational systems use so much. What can they substitute, and how can they begin?
Yes. Well, this is, again, one of those practical problems of finding out what a particular person finds reinforcing. But if you take the old pattern of learning to play the piano, in every neighborhood in my day there was a teacher of the piano, and she had pupils, and she or he, in my case, I was a man who taught me the piano very briefly. He would call once a week at our house, and I would sit down and play the morning prayer by someone named Striabog. His name was Gobers, but he reversed it, and for very good reason, because I'm sure he would be proud of having composed this piece of music. And I would be jabbed in the ribs if I made a mistake, and so on. And I practiced this. I hated it, and gave it up as quickly as my parents would allow me to. And this is a fairly common pattern. One thing, you've got to play perfectly, because there's going to be a spring recital that all the students get together and play this kind of thing. Nothing could be done to make people less interested in making music. Now, there are natural reinforcers in the field of music, and all sorts of noisy things that kids love to bang on and so on. And I'm sure that you could build a kind of kindergarten of music in which kids would have a lot of fun making noises, and you could program it in such a way that they have to make more and more complicated noises. You see this with kids getting rhythms and so on. They are reinforcing themselves. The rhythms are reinforcing, and these things grow. You become better and better at this. But I would think also you might want to have, for one thing, you'd want to program the material in such a way that progress is pretty conspicuous, not just finishing one piece every year for a spring recital, but actually quite clearly doing much more with your music than you had ever done before.
Let's take another example, reading, which is both a basic goal of schools and something that, in terms of the increased leisure life that people may have, a great deal of satisfaction is to be had from reading. Yet our statistics show that the average American reads no books a year.
Okay.
The consequence of 12 or 13 years of education has been no interest in reading books.
Right.
Or the average college graduate reads something like 0.7 books a year. And there's no indication of what kind of books those are anyway. Given these kinds of figures, it doesn't appear, with a massive effort being made in our educational system to teach reading, that people are reading very much at all. How might you begin to do this? This is a goal that almost everybody in our society would value.
How well have they learned to read, you see? If you don't read very well, if you've got to figure out words and whatnot, then it's not pleasurable to read a book, and you stay away from it. You ought to learn at a very early age, I think, to read fluently and in ways which don't wear out your larynx when you're reading silently to yourself, and permit you then to get the pleasurable side of books. We have tended to get away from an emphasis on verbal behavior as such. People do read the comics, they read what is in the balloons, and that's enough because the picture tells them the rest. Or they subscribe to magazines which have pictures and very little text, and the pictures are doing most of the work. Or they watch TV with no printed material to read. So you can say, well, we're getting away from reading, but I don't think that's true either. I think that actually a great deal of our thinking is verbal, and if we fall back entirely on visual and other presentations, we'll be doing less and less thinking all the time and solving problems and that sort of thing. I think the trouble is not that we haven't spent a lot of effort in teaching reading, but we've done so very badly. In the old days, when the punitive systems were feasible, you learned to read or else. It was that kind of thing, and people did learn to read, and many of them read a great deal and enjoyably. But by relaxing the punitive contingencies and not bringing in anything else, we're failing to teach quick, easy reading, the kind that would make it reinforcing to read something. And we are not also making subject matters important enough to people that care about learning something new about things. I think this can be done. I've had a hand in developing a reading series where you use immediate contrived reinforcers for evaluation of sentences or just words and so on, so that there is a fascination. The kids like this. They work with it. They're always discovering that they have read something correctly, and in doing so, they do learn to read and fluently enough, I believe, so that eventually they can begin to read for pleasure. But to begin with, you can't read for pleasure. Run, spot, run. That's not pleasurable, and it's absurd to expect that you can design primers in reading which are going to be naturally interesting to a child compared with television or something of that kind. But you can build in contrived contingencies that will get the child through the early stages of reading to the point of the kind of fluency which makes reading a pleasure.
Is the fact that so many people learn to read under an adversive system it all related to the fact that people don't seem to read when the adversive system is no longer there?
When it comes to an end, you just stop. This is something you've had to do. Now you don't have to do it, so you don't do it. I think that's very largely what is involved. Moreover, in these aversive contingencies, you don't learn to read very fluently, and that's a terribly important thing. It's like playing the piano. If you never play well, you don't play. You don't get any fun out of it. But if you learn to play well, then the natural reinforcers of the music you're producing begin to come through. If you read hesitantly, sounding things out and so on, you're not going to get any fun out of that, and you'll stop as soon as you have to. Then as soon as you're permitted to.
Let's take another issue. What about developing people to be deeply concerned about their fellow man? Concern for his physical welfare,
yes.
Concern for the style of life he has, the quality of life he has. How might the school work on that?
Well, that is actually very close. I thought you probably were going to ask me, why is it better for a culture to develop the individual rather than allow him to sit stoned all his life, though happy? And I think the answer to that is that the culture is stronger if each member develops himself as fully as possible. And he would be most able to meet emergencies. He would make progressive changes and improvements in the culture. He would develop better art forms, better science, and so on. But I think you have to take the future of the culture into account. And a culture which allows everyone just to sit and watch professional football, have with a few lottery tickets and waiting for the next number to be reported and drunk half the time, that's a bad culture because it would not be able to tackle any problem and solve the problem well, as people are not developing their natural interests. And I think this is the criterion, that you want to build the individual so that he is most effective, most capable of doing what may need to be done to survive, and for the culture to survive. And I think it's up to education to build into the individual those behaviors which will most likely work for the survival of the culture. I think that's the only ultimate value that we face. Happiness is not the ultimate value. In general, it's better than unhappiness, because people who are happy are likely to be they're likely to be developing as possible towards something better. But there are instant happinesses of one kind or another, but that is not true. And simply to say that culture is best in which people are happiest, it isn't true, because you could have a very happy culture that would go down the drain the next time an emergency arose.
Let's return to the notion of the school developing people as people, and take, for example, the Adlerian notion of social interest, or being concerned with one's fellow man and working for the betterment of other human beings. What can the school do to develop this kind of humanistic value?
Well, what does society do in the first place? The school is doing it for society. How do you move from a culture in which each man is out entirely for himself to a culture in which the individual takes another person into account, and then perhaps eventually reaches that stage expressed by John Donne in a very famous passage, "No man is an island. We are all part of the main. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls. When someone dies, part of you dies. The welfare of everyone is your good." You see. If you can put that across, then that culture is going to be strong because it will disseminate its goods. Everybody will have the support of everybody else. I think it's no question that culture which manages to make its members help each other and take the good of each other into account is a strong culture. But it's not the best culture. Now that's because the greatest good of the greatest number isn't an ultimate kind of value. Great right now, but it may miss the future, which is a terribly important thing in a culture in which we all are brothers and are each other's keeper, and we keep each other well. You see, this might not be developed at all. It could be static. It could be, this would mean simply give everybody a bottle of whiskey a week and a television set, and that would be what I do for you, is to give you all of this, but you would not be developing. And the greatest good of the greatest number has got oriented toward the future. And if we simply settled for thoughtfulness about our fellow men, we may be missing the boat.
Clearly, this raises the issue of how much diversity can a society tolerate and how much power should be given to the school. For example, the rebel today, the young person who's dropping out, as opposed to engaging themselves in a culture, the school is a purveyor of middle-class values. How do you design a system to tolerate and to enhance, indeed, the rebel?
Well, the rebel is a figure which has place only in an imperfect system. And things are bad, someone's got to change them. And we call him a rebel because he's making changes. If you simply go into a school system and say, look, here's a better teaching, why don't you use it? Nobody calls you a rebel. They call you a rebel when you attack the present system, not because you put something better in its place. Now, I think a good culture would have very few rebels, and a culture would have none. And that would not be any great loss. We value the rebel because our cultures have been so bad in the past. But to say, what would you do in a perfect culture about the rebel is about like saying to Isaac Newton, what would you do about a body that goes the wrong way in a gravitational field? There wouldn't be rebels in a perfect culture. Well, that's something to dream about and not to talk about, really, because we're not going to have that kind of culture. But the rebel has been someone who has done something in this, and he's had to do it by breaking into the present system, so we call him a rebel. I think in the future we won't have rebels, we'll have improvers, but they won't have to rebel, they won't have to attack, they will simply change and move things into the future. If you don't like the life someone is handing you now, there are three things you can do. You can destroy it and try to build something else in the ashes. You can walk away from it and set up another culture of your own somewhere else. That's the utopian escape pattern. Or you can take the present culture and improve it bit by bit. And that, I think, is what a technology of behavior is most likely to do at the present time. I think we can now improve teaching practices, improve incentive conditions, we can improve the ways in which people are induced to behave well with respect to each other and so on.
What do you mean by behaving well with respect to each other?
Well, not robbing each other or stealing from each other and so on, the kinds of things that allow you to spend without watching over your shoulder to see who's going to knife you and so on.
What about in the positive sense, in the non-destructive sense?
Well,
enhancing the individual.
Yes, well, this is a kind of thing which made culture strong. When you get people who teach so that other people are more effective, you have an example of that. When you get someone who designs an incentive system, not just for the profits he's going to make out, but to produce the goods the culture needs, and you have that, because after all, if people need food, then an agricultural system is a way of helping others, because they consume the food you produce. You may do it for selfish reasons, or you do it for philanthropic reasons. You are helping others when you raise food. You are helping others when you teach. You're helping others when you counsel in therapy and so on.
How might the school system enhance the development of philanthropic behavior?
This is, again, a practical problem that needs to be tackled as such. I would simply suggest relevant principles, find out under what conditions people do indeed take goods of others into account, and how do they reinforce them. Now, we've had historical examples of that, of course. A strong state can induce its members to be patriotic and to fight for the state, which is a way of working for the good of others. A religion can suggest martyrdom, the sacrifice of the individual for the good of the religion or the good of the people who practice that religion. These are techniques. You may criticize some of them. You may say it's pretty rough on the person who got controlled that way. He died for others, but what did he get out of it? That's a question very often. But I think that you could, without too much difficulty, given culture, arrange contingencies under which the culture makes sure that those who do things for the good of others are themselves reinforced. Don't appeal to their compassion or their generosity or anything of that kind. Those are feelings and they're not going to help you. Appeal instead to the contingencies under which behavior of helping others is actually reinforced.
Let's take the practical issue again of developing philanthropic behavior. You mentioned earlier that some of the other philosophies of education are really preventing, in their technology, the development of various kinds of behavior. The humanistic system clearly values philanthropic behavior. You value philanthropic behavior, but you're saying something else. The technology you're describing is far more powerful in developing philanthropic behavior than is the humanistic educational system.
I would say that,
Why is
yes.
that? Why is that? What should they be doing differently?
Well, I think they're doing suggested. They are looking for help to the inner man, his feelings, his compassion, and so on. I've pointed out elsewhere that there are some great classical examples of mistreatment. The care of children in orphanages, the care of old people in homes for old people, prisons, the care of psychotics, and the care of retardates. These are systems which from the beginning of time have always deteriorated, so that conditions are perfectly awful. And then some kind of reform sweeps in. Before you know it, it's back again. Now you say, oh, well, that's because we need compassionate people. We need humane people who will love children and take good care of them, will be fond of old people and take good care of them, who will have the interests of the prisoner at heart, and you know that you've heard this sort of thing. I point out that the only reason that those 5 areas are classical examples of mistreatment is that all 5 classes of people are unable to exert counter-control. The children are small to do anything about the mistreatment. The old people are too weak. The prisoners are under armed guard. Psychotics and retardates, they can't escape, they can't counterattack at all. So why they're being mistreated, not because people lack compassion, but because there is no positive reason for treating them well. The aversive control, which keeps you treating me well and me treating you well, is lacking, and it's a lopsided condition where no control is counter-control is possible. Now, if you want people to be treated well in these institutions, make sure that someone makes sure that mistreatment is not punished, is punished somehow or other. Now, you say, well, now you're going back on aversive control and recommending it. Well, I would recommend it as a first step, but counter-control isn't again the ultimate. If someone steps in and says, look, you're going to keep these kids well or you're going to be fired from this your job in the orphanage, then they may get more humane or compassionate treatment. But in the long run, what you want is not somebody who is afraid to miss it, but someone who treats well because he understands what he's doing and knows how to treat well. And further knowledge of human behavior is the answer to this, I think. Not more compassion, but some contingencies which induce people to treat people well, some knowledge that enables them to do it effectively.